You used to know every face in this Senate chamber. Tonight, looking around at the assembled crowd, you realize you no longer recognize nearly half of them, and somehow that small, simple fact tells you more about what has actually changed than any single political event ever could. You are Cato. You have spent decades serving the Roman Republic, watching its institutions slowly, gradually transform into something increasingly unrecognizable from the system you originally swore to protect and defend. Tonight, sitting quietly among senators whose names you barely know, you find yourself reflecting on exactly how this transformation actually happened, not through any single dramatic moment, but through countless small accumulating changes that individually seemed reasonable, even necessary. Feel the particular grief contained within this kind of loss, not sudden and shocking, but slow and gradual. The way a familiar landscape changes so incrementally that you only notice the full transformation once you finally stop and genuinely compare where you currently stand against where you originally began. You remember Rome as it existed during your youth, imperfect, certainly often frustrating in its slow, deliberate processes, but genuinely committed to certain foundational principles: shared governance, accountability before law. The basic conviction that no single man's ambition should ever be permitted to override the collective will of the Roman people. Tonight, you watch ambitious men maneuver constantly for personal advantage, watch political offices increasingly purchased rather than genuinely earned, watch military commanders building personal loyalty among their own legions rather than maintaining loyalty toward Rome's collective government itself. Epictetus, not yet born, would one day teach that we suffer not from events themselves, but from our judgments about those events. You sit with this principle tonight, examining honestly whether your own grief represents genuine wisdom, recognizing real institutional decline, or simply an older man's natural, perhaps unreasonable resistance toward inevitable change that every generation eventually experiences regarding the world they originally grew up within. You consider this question seriously, refusing to let yourself retreat into comfortable, simple answers that avoid its actual difficulty. You decide, after careful reflection, that some genuine institutional decline is actually happening separate from simple generational nostalgia, evidenced not merely by your own personal feeling, but by concrete, observable changes in how Roman political power actually operates compared to previous generations. The legions now follow individual generals rather than the Senate itself, a dangerous precedent that began gradually, seemingly reasonable during specific military campaigns, yet steadily accumulating into something considerably more concerning regarding where genuine military loyalty ultimately resides. You think about Marius decades earlier, reforming Rome's military recruitment in ways that initially seemed purely practical, addressing genuine manpower shortages, yet inadvertently creating armies whose soldiers increasingly depended on their commanding general's personal patronage rather than the state's collective authority. You think about Sulla afterward, marching his own legions directly into Rome itself, an action that would have been considered unthinkable treason merely a generation earlier, yet somehow became simply another unfortunate chapter within Rome's increasingly turbulent political history. Marcus Aurelius would write, generations after tonight, that the impediment to action advances action, what stands in the way becomes the way. You think of this principle now, recognizing that each individual obstacle Rome's traditional institutions encountered across recent decades seemed to produce not genuine institutional strengthening, but instead gradual erosion. Each crisis somehow justifying further concentration of power into fewer and fewer increasingly ambitious hands. You watch wealthy senators around you tonight, men whose fortunes derive increasingly from provincial exploitation rather than honest service, men who view political office primarily as opportunity for personal enrichment rather than genuine civic responsibility. You do not condemn every single one of them entirely, recognizing honestly that Rome's traditional political culture always contained some genuine ambition and self-interest alongside its better, more principled elements. But you recognize, watching tonight's particular gathering, that the balance has shifted considerably, that self-interest increasingly dominates where genuine civic principle once held considerably more influence over how Roman political life actually operated. You think about your own career, decades spent opposing exactly this kind of gradual institutional decay, recognizing honestly tonight that your efforts, however genuinely principled, have not actually succeeded in reversing this larger accumulating trend. This recognition produces genuine grief. You admit honestly to yourself, sitting quietly among unfamiliar faces tonight. You have fought consistently for decades against forces that appear, examined honestly, to be winning regardless of your continued resistance. Epictetus would teach that some things are within our control and some things are not, and that wisdom consists entirely in correctly identifying that crucial distinction. You think of this principle now, applying it honestly to tonight's particular grief, recognizing that Rome's larger institutional trajectory has never actually been entirely within your own individual control. Regardless of how consistently and energetically you have opposed its gradual transformation, what remains within your control, you recognize clearly, is simply your own conduct throughout this slow, difficult decline, your own consistent refusal to personally participate in the corruption increasingly surrounding you, your own continued willingness to speak honestly, even when honest speech accomplishes considerably less than you might genuinely prefer it to accomplish. You think of Cato, the elder, your own great-grandfather, who similarly worried about Roman moral decline generations earlier, recognizing with some genuine comfort that concern about institutional decline has apparently existed within your own family's tradition across multiple successive generations, suggesting perhaps that this particular struggle has always been ongoing, never genuinely resolved, simply continued by each successive generation, according to its own particular circumstances. This recognition offers strange comfort tonight. You realize, examining your own internal state honestly, you are not somehow uniquely failing where previous generations somehow succeeded. You are simply participating in an ongoing, perhaps permanently unresolved struggle between concentrated power and genuine collective governance. A struggle that apparently characterizes human political organization across multiple successive generations rather than representing some unique failure specifically belonging to your own particular historical moment. You think about younger senators occasionally approaching you privately, expressing genuine admiration for your consistent principle, even while ultimately choosing different, more accommodating paths themselves within their own developing careers. You do not entirely blame them for this choice, recognizing honestly that consistent opposition against Rome's gradual institutional drift carries genuine personal cost that not everyone reasonably feels capable of bearing throughout their entire career. But you also recognize, watching tonight's gathering, that your own continued example matters precisely because it remains genuinely rare, a demonstrated possibility that accommodation toward gradual corruption is never actually inevitable, regardless of how powerfully circumstances seem to encourage it. You think of every speech you have given across decades opposing concentrated power, every vote cast against legislation that would have further consolidated authority into fewer ambitious hands, and you recognize honestly that these individual actions, however consistently maintained, have not actually reversed Rome's larger institutional trajectory. Yet you also recognize something else, examining your own settled, peaceful internal state despite tonight's genuine grief regarding Rome's gradual transformation. Your own character throughout this difficult decline remains genuinely, completely your own, untouched by the larger institutional corruption surrounding it, regardless of how powerfully that corruption continues accumulating around your own continued, consistent resistance. This is perhaps the genuine difference between despair and authentic Stoic acceptance. You reflect tonight, sitting quietly among unfamiliar faces within a Senate chamber that increasingly resembles something considerably different from what you originally swore to protect and defend. Despair would mean abandoning your own principled conduct simply because larger institutional trends appear to be moving steadily against everything you genuinely value. Authentic acceptance means continuing that same principled conduct anyway, understanding clearly that your own actions' ultimate historical significance remains genuinely uncertain, while your own character throughout this difficult ongoing process remains, regardless of external outcome, completely and entirely within your continued control. You think of every future generation who might eventually study this particular period of Roman history, recognizing honestly that you cannot actually control how they will eventually judge your own efforts. Whether they remember you as someone who genuinely helped preserve Republican principles for at least one additional difficult generation, or simply as one more well-intentioned man who ultimately failed against historical forces considerably larger than any single individual's resistance could genuinely overcome. You decide, examining this uncertainty honestly tonight, that this particular judgment, however it eventually resolves itself, does not actually change what you genuinely owe to your own remaining years of continued service. Consistent, principled conduct, regardless of whatever ultimate historical verdict eventually emerges regarding its actual practical effectiveness. If you're listening to this and currently watching something you genuinely love slowly transform into something you barely recognize, whether an institution, a community, or simply the broader world around you, know that Cato once sat exactly where you might be sitting now, grieving genuine institutional decline while refusing to let that grief alone determine his own continued conduct. This is why Severus Stoic exists, to bring you these honest, complicated chapters of Stoic history, acknowledging genuine grief regarding larger forces beyond individual control, while still demonstrating what genuine integrity actually looks like throughout that difficult, ongoing process. If this story reached something true in you, subscribe to Severus Stoic so more of these journeys continue finding their way to you exactly when you need them most. Leave a comment below and tell me about something you genuinely love but has slowly transformed into something you barely recognize, and how you have managed to maintain your own integrity throughout that particular difficult process. Your comments help this channel grow, and they help other people recognize they are not alone in grieving institutional or personal changes that feel genuinely beyond their own individual control. Cato watched Rome gradually transform across his entire lifetime, recognizing honestly that his own resistance could not entirely reverse that larger institutional trajectory, yet continuing his own principled conduct regardless. Remember this the next time you watch something you genuinely love slowly transform into something increasingly unfamiliar. You cannot always control the larger trajectory surrounding you. You can always control whether your own character remains genuinely, consistently yourself throughout that difficult, ongoing process.